my name is Izzy. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different than what I usually do, and we're going to be talking about Delaware's one and only serial killer, the Route 40 killer. So our story today is going to begin with a woman named Shirley Ann Ellis. Now, she was 23 years old and she was a former prostitute. However, sources say she had actually moved away from that kind of lifestyle and occupation and had bought nursing textbooks with the intention of beginning nursing school. And now on November 29th, 1987, around 6 o'clock, Shirley Ann Ellis left her home in Brookmont Farms, Newark. She was bringing Thanksgiving leftovers to an AIDS patient at the Wilmington Hospital. Now, the weather was particularly cold and rainy that night, and it was about a 14-mile trip from her home to the hospital. And because of her days as a prostitute, she was familiar with hitchhiking the Route 40 highway. So she decided, I guess, that would be the best way to get there. Which, I mean, I understand. I wouldn't want to walk 14 miles in the rain at the end of November in Delaware. It definitely gets pretty cold around that time of year. So I get where she was coming from. Now, a little bit over 3 hours after she left the house the same night, it was around 9:25 p.m., two teenagers were just walking around looking for like a secluded area to make out or whatever, get a little intimate, and they came across a woman's body. And unfortunately, this was the body of Miss Shirley Ann Ellis. She did not make it to the hospital to deliver that meal. And I imagine this was quite a brutal scene for the teenagers to see. Miss Ellis's body was partially undressed and her legs were spread apart, although there was no evidence of sexual assault. Her ankles and wrists had been bound. There was some black duct tape still attached to strands of her hair, which authorities believe was used to silence her and to muffle her screams. What a nightmare. She had been tortured and mutilated with work tools. A ligature was tied around her neck to strangle her, but her cause of death was bludgeoning to the head with a hammer. Now, obviously, this killing came as a shock to the small state of Delaware. Unfortunately, however, authorities really didn't know what to make of it. They had no real leads. It really didn't seem like anyone had a motive to kill Miss Ellis. And for a while, they were just assuming that it was probably like an interstate trucker, but they didn't have any particular person in mind. They really had no direction to head in. However, about 7 months later, this would have been June 28th, 1988, at around 11:30 p.m., a 31-year-old woman named Catherine DeMauro was walking down the Route 40 highway. Now, Miss DeMauro had a history of prostitution. However, it is unclear if she was working that night or if she was just walking down the highway trying to find a ride. Not that it really matters either way, to be honest. And unfortunately, at about 6:30 in the morning the next day, construction workers on the Fox Run apartments came across Miss DeMauro's body. Now, this time the body was found completely nude, but many, many other aspects of the killing mirrored the killing of Miss Shirley Ann Ellis. The hands and feet were bound, a ligature was tied around her neck, she had been bludgeoned in the head with a hammer, and she had been tortured and mutilated with work tools. Now, a lot of the articles I read did not say specifically how they were tortured and mutilated. It just mentioned work tools. Now, I did find one or two that did say that some of the victims' pliers were used to squeeze isn't the right word, to mutilate the nipples on the victims, and at least one victim had at least one nipple completely removed. He would also beat them with bruises being found on the back sides of the victims. So sad. I mean, that's just like so many people's worst nightmares, right? Nobody likes pain. Anyway, but there was one key difference in the killing of Catherine DeMauro, and that was that her body was covered with these strange blue fibers. So after the DeMauro killing, the Delaware State Police and the Newcastle County Police Department formed a task force with the intention of finding the person responsible for these killings. They met with the FBI Behavioral Science Unit, and their worst fears were confirmed that there was, in fact, a serial killer loose in the small state of Delaware. James Heddick, who was a member of the task force, as well as a former captain of the Newcastle County Police Department, said that the task force had access to an airplane, rental cars, a helicopter, and had an unlimited budget, all devoted to bringing the person responsible for these murders down. Which is pretty rare. Most of the time there is a budget on these kind of things, which just goes to show you that they really wanted to get this person, male or female, responsible off the streets. So within the task force, female officers began to pose as undercover prostitutes to try and gather information. And then other members of the task force were focused on identifying the blue fibers on DeMauro's body. They figured if they could identify where these fibers came from, they could get a leg up on finding who the killer was. Now, on August 22nd, a woman named Margaret Finner was last seen entering a blue Ford panel van on US Route 13. And unfortunately, about 3 months later, her body was found near the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal. Her body had obviously been decaying this whole time, and because of that, by the time they found her, she was in such a state that they really couldn't determine much about cause of death or anything like that. Now, less than a month after Finner's disappearance, but before her body was found, Officer Renee Tashner was posing as a prostitute. She was part of the task force and was trying to, find information about the killings. Now, while walking down Route 40, she noticed the same blue Ford panel van passed her about 7 times in a 20-minute period. So obviously she found this odd. So she walks to a more secluded area, and lo and behold, the driver of the panel van stops to speak to her. And I just thought I would add this, just a side note. Some of the sources I read said that Officer Tashner was very popular as a, prostitute, where people from all walks of life would stop and try to get her services, doctors, lawyers, school teachers. Sometimes there would even be a line of cars all waiting to talk to her. People just really seemed to like her for that. So when the driver of the blue Ford panel van pulled over to speak to Officer Tashner, he opened up the side panel of the vehicle. And to Officer Tashner's horror, she saw that the inside of the van had blue carpeting. Remember the blue fibers that were found on Catherine DeMauro's body? Who knows? While speaking to the driver of the van, she kind of runs her hand through the carpet, grabbing some fibers so they could be tested. Also, while this was happening, there was another officer who was hidden who was getting the tag number of the vehicle. So when they ran the tags to the blue Ford panel van, they found that it was registered to a man named Stephen Brian Pennell. He was married and had children and had no previous criminal record. He was an electrician. But some sources say that he had studied criminology at the University of Delaware. Now, most people who knew Pennell just described him as your average American dad, but Officer Tashner said that when she spoke to him, when she was undercover as the prostitute, remember she got the blue fibers, that he was very cold, that he was unlike any of the other men who pulled over trying to speak to her. Like he had this coldness to him, and he was just looking right through her. And only 2 days after Pennell's encounter with Officer Tashner, a 22-year-old sex worker named Michelle Gordon disappeared after being seen entering a blue Ford panel van. I'm sure you can see the terrible pattern happening here now. It's really awful to think about. I'm around the same age as all these women. I could only imagine what my family would do if this happened to me or one of my friends. It's just, so awful to think about, right? Now, a few days after Gordon's disappearance, her body washed up on the Chesapeake and Delaware canal. Now, during her autopsy, they found that she had cocaine in her system, which actually caused her heart to stop beating while she was being tortured instead of being hit in the head with a hammer like some of the other victims. Basically, it made her heart stop because of the cocaine in her system. Her body just couldn't withstand the torture. Which, honestly, I was thinking about that, and I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. If you're going to die anyway, I guess you'd rather go through less pain, right? And on September 23rd, Kathleen Meyer, who actually lived in the same neighborhood as the first victim, Shirley Ann Ellis, what was the neighborhood called? Brookmont Farms, was last seen entering a blue Ford panel van. Now, there was actually a witness this time to her entering the vehicle, and he happened to be an off-duty cop. So he knew that a blue Ford panel van was associated with, like, the recent string of killings, so he wrote down the tag number, and the car belonged to none other than Stephen Brian Pennell. Unfortunately, however, even though there was a witness, Miss Meyer's body has still not been found to this day. Now, at the same time as the Gordon and Meyer killings, the task force was having the blue fibers found on DeMaro's body compared with the carpet fibers that Officer Tashner removed from Stephen Pennell's vehicle, and they also kind of started following Pennell. Officer Tashner actually sat next to him at a Moody Blues concert and spoke to his daughter when she came up to her asking for a donation to a school fundraiser. Now, eventually a search warrant was procured for Mr. Pennell's van, and they found a torture kit inside, which included pliers, knives, restraints, whips, needles, just a murder kit, basically. And remember how I said that the nipples of the victims had been, like, torsioned or removed with pliers or a plier-like tool? That's likely what he was using, the pliers in the kit. They found DNA, like hair and blood, matching the victims in the carpet of the vehicle. It just didn't look good for him at this point, right? And on November 29th, 1988, exactly 1 year to the day from the murder of the first victim, Shirley Ann Ellis, Stephen Brian Pennell was arrested, and he was being charged for the murders of Michelle Gordon, Catherine DeMaro, and Shirley Ann Ellis. Unfortunately, though, Mr. Pennell did not confess and just chose to remain silent the entire time. Interestingly, this case, the Pennell murder case, was actually the first case in the United States where DNA evidence was treated as, like, solid evidence, like absolute criminal evidence in a criminal case. Now, it's not the first conviction using DNA. Someone was convicted before him, but it was the first one to use it seriously, if that makes any sense. Now, during the trial, Pennell took the stand, basically trying to explain how the DNA of all those women ended up in his vehicle. And it made him look like a jackass. It didn't do any favors for him. At one point, he said that the reason that DeMaro's DNA would be in his car is because he offered her $25 if she would perform oral sex on him. And he joked that she even gave him $10 back after it was all over. Like, obviously the jury didn't like that. It was a completely distasteful joke, and many people in the courtroom said that he just made himself look terrible, that he spoke about the victims like they were garbage or like they weren't human. He didn't do himself any favors, that's for sure. His lawyer even said that he tried to, like, work with him and tell him how to be, like, more likable to the jury, but he just couldn't change who he was at the core, and he acted how he was going to act, basically. Now, after 8 days of deliberation, which is actually the longest in Delaware history, at least at the time, the jury came back. Now, they found Stephen Brian Pennell guilty of the murders of Ellis and DeMaro. However, the jury was deadlocked on the Gordon murder, and that was because there was a, lack of evidence, basically. And he was sentenced to 2 life sentences. A few days after the trial, the prosecutor received a bouquet of flowers. The bouquet had a card in it that said, "You made us feel human again," from the women of Route 40. However, the story doesn't end here. Pinnell's lawyers tried to fight the ruling from the trial, saying that the carpet fibers that Officer Tashner obtained were illegally obtained. However, the court wasn't having it. And he did end up getting charged again, this time for the murders of Michelle Gordon and Kathleen Meyer based on new evidence. Now, this is where things start to get weird. Like, just strange. I had never heard of this before in a serial killer murder trial. Stephen Pinnell never confessed. He never admitted guilt, nothing like that. However, he was asking for the death penalty. He was speaking in court as if he were the prosecutor trying to prosecute himself, like speaking in the third person. At one point he said, and I quote, "The perpetrator must have sensed a pleasure in the killings, since he did not commit just one, but continued in the same depraved manner. This pleasure is evident." See, it's like he's talking about someone else that's not him. How are you going to ask for the death penalty, but then not confess? It just seems strange to me. He was also citing Bible passages as proof that he should be executed. I believe one of the verses was Numbers chapter 35, verse 30 or something like that, basically saying that any man who kills another man should be put to death. I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what it was. And I guess not surprisingly, the judge did grant him the death penalty. He was sentenced to death. Now, a few people tried to appeal this, although not Stephen Pinnell himself. One of the people being his wife. She was trying to say that he was insane and that he just didn't grasp the gravity of what he was doing. He didn't understand what the death penalty ultimately meant for him. However, they did a psychiatric evaluation of him. However, he was found to be of sound mind, and the execution date was set for March 14th, 1992. Now, Pinnell refused to do any interviews up until right before his execution, and the interviewers were assuming that he was finally going to explain why he did it, or give the location of Miss Meyer's body, who had still never been found up until this point. However, he really disappointed everybody, and he pretty much just talked about what he might have for his final meal. Really disappointing. He was executed at the Smyrna prison. I believe it's called the James T. Vaughn Correctional Center. And he was the first person to be executed in Delaware since 1946. But yeah, that is the story of the Route 40 killer. Sometimes he is also known as the corridor killer or the blue fiber killer. We still don't know why he did what he did. It's awful. My heart goes out to the victims of these crimes. It's just really sad. I mean, it's just really sad. But I never knew that there was a Delaware serial killer. Did you guys know that? Have you ever heard of the Route 40 killer before? Because I hadn't. I'm always interested in these kind of things. I don't know why. They pique my interest, I guess. Alright, so I know today's video is a little different than the videos I normally do. Please comment below or just let me know if you would like to see more kind of videos like this. Alright guys, and if you liked this video, please do not forget to like and subscribe. And as always, I will see you next week. Bye!